I'm Skip Barlow, and I'm here tonight to do a presentation on the early frontiersmen of the northeastern quadrant of the United States. It was a very interesting time after the Revolutionary War, and I'm honored to be here with the Bourne Historic Society presenting this story of local men involved in the Revolutionary period and the years following. Only in the long run could statehood provide Maine's backcountry farmers with relief from grasping proprietors, merchant creditors, lawyers, and sheriffs. In the short run, frontiersmen had to rely on their own efforts against a hostile world, though organized through organized violence. In mobs thinly disguised as Indians, frontiersmen terrorized, beat, and occasionally murdered those or their agents who threatened their existence. Alan Taylor's analysis of Indian leader Nathan Barlow reveals a popular culture suffused with poverty and primitive democracy. This explosive mix provided legitimacy for resisting the power of evil, even when that power was the government itself. Taylor points out that Barlow's mystical experience in particular gave him the credentials necessary for leadership amongst the farmer folk. When he was arrested, convicted, and imprisoned, however, high expectations that he had aroused quickly crumbled, and the resistance to authority dwindled. The beginning of this story starts in the late 1760s. Thomas Barlow of the Pocasset area of Sandwich died, and he left his estate to his 5 sons, who were all minors at the time. Barlow had been somewhat of a revolutionary, and he was a coastal trader. His sons followed immediately into his footsteps. They kept the business going, sailing, coastal trading. In the mid-1770s, when the revolution was beginning, there was a lot of things going on. The town of Sandwich, which is a good distance from Pocasset, actually governed Pocasset. The Sandwich selectmen at the time were British loyalists. Barlow's not so much. As soon as the revolutionary taxing got really heavy in Boston, the Barlow boys discussed it and decided they were going to rig a boat out and sail down to the East Indies and get a whole bunch of goods and bring them back and sell them. That's what they did. They were coastal traders. The selectmen in Sandwich got wind of this, and they sent their sheriff to Pocasset to impound the Barlow's sales. Unfortunately, the man who was the sheriff was a Swift. He was a good friend of the Barlows. He went right to him and said, "Hey, this is what's happening. I have to impound your sales, but before I got here, you put them up and you sailed out of the harbor, right?" And they said, "Yeah." And he reported back to the selectmen that as he approached Barlow's Landing, the vessel was leaving the harbor. Of course, the Barlow boys, they did go down to the East Indies and they did the Caribbean, and they gathered up everything they could buy and brought it back to the area of Pocasset, which at that time was called Barlow Town. It was just Barlows everywhere there. And they brought their goods back and they set up to sell them, and that was fine. And the selectmen in Sandwich were very unhappy with them. As the war progressed, these 5 boys were involved in the Revolutionary War. They were privateers. And when the war was over, they went their own separate ways. One went to Rochester and became a deacon. 2 went to Newport and became traders and boat builders. One of them, Obed, he decided he was going to go to Maine. and his oldest son, Nathan, thought this was a pretty good idea. Maine was a new frontier at that time. Wasn't settled at all. People were going up there and claiming 100 acres, 200 acres of land, and they would homestead it, and they would basically squat on it. And as time went by, when they'd improve the land and make it farmable and make it productive, they would go get a quitclaim deed from the county at that time, and it was all associated with the colonial government of Massachusetts. There was no state of Maine at the time. So they went up, and, like hundreds of other families, they staked out their claim, like later on people would do in a gold rush, and they improved the land. And lo and behold, people with a lot of money were going to the courts with these deeds that they would produce that were pre-revolutionary deeds claiming ownership to this land that had never been surveyed. But the situation at the time with the colonial government, because the government was in recession, because the country was in a recession, because after the war, we were kind of knocked out of the picture with the British for a lot of reasons, for trading and supplies and everything else. So we were in trouble. And these people were producing these deeds to this land, and the courts were backing them up. The colonial courts were backing them up. It was it just did not appear right to these people who were out. 700 families are out in the wilderness staking out claims, and all of a sudden, they're just surviving. They're working really hard. And all of a sudden, some British nobleman claims ownership to the land that they're on. And the courts are recognizing these handwritten, illegible deeds. They're recognizing them. And these people aren't happy. They're working really hard to survive, to provide for their children, to have the life that they feel they deserve. They fought in the Revolution for this. They truly did. And they were being denied their opportunity by the courts of Massachusetts. It was crazy. They were angry. They would get bills for taxes on places where towns didn't even exist. Banks were foreclosing on these people, taking their land. People like you and me who were very, very angry. Then they started forming little groups, and they called themselves the White Indians. Pretty soon, these people who would kind of masquerade as Native Americans, when the sheriff would come out with his writ to foreclose on them, they weren't real happy about it. So they organized. And there were a number of leaders. Most of them would cave in as the government pressured them. But there was this one man, Nathan Barlow. He was the son of Obed. They had both homesteaded land up there, close to each other. And there was the Robinson family, and the Shirtliff family, and a whole bunch of different families up there from this area who had homesteaded land. Well, one night when Nathan was going home, after a meeting with all these people, according to his wife, as he entered the door, he fell to the floor. She could not revive him. Her 18-month-old daughter jumped on him. Nothing. No response at all. No apparent anything. She could not revive him. After a time, perhaps an hour or so, Nathan regained consciousness. And his wife said, what happened? What happened? And he said, you'll never believe me. And he explained that as he fell to the floor, Christ had appeared and had grabbed his soul from his body and had taken him on this journey. And he flew through the air. And he descended to the ocean, to the depths of the earth. And there, in a vast, vast, vast area, there were thousands and hundreds of thousands of souls in agony, chained and being beaten. And the devil himself was there. And although there was fire and there was smoke, and there was a blue haze, he could not feel the heat. And Christ took him all around, and he saw people who had died that he knew. He knew where he was. And he was there for a time. He had no idea how long. And then Christ took him straight up through the ocean and into the sky and beyond the moon to the pearly gates of heaven. And it was here that he saw the smiling faces of people joyfully singing choruses and dancing and just so happy to be alive. Yet they were all dead also. And he recognized some of these people too. And he spoke with them. His grandfather, who told him, you don't understand. You are on earth to enjoy your life, not to impose your will on other people. You have to return. You have to tell your people what I'm telling you. You don't have to kowtow to government. You don't have to do what others tell you. Have your own life. Live it. Worship God. He will take care of you. And Nathan was kind of shook up. And Christ took him again and took him back to earth into his body. And he's told his wife this story. And he said, I just can't believe it. I must have hit my head. And immediately, wham, back on the floor he goes. Again, his wife cannot revive him. They shake him, they move him around, her and her other children, they try to do stuff, anything with him. But he is gone once again. Christ has grabbed him again and said, pay attention, man. And he took him back to hell. And he toured hell again. And he took him back to heaven. And he said, pay attention. The earth is there for you to enjoy. Take care of it. This is your opportunity. You can feel. You can love. You can feel warmth. You can feel cold. You can do all those things that you can't do here as a spirit. You are in heaven right now with your children, with your life. Enjoy it. Nathan kind of stepped back and said, wow, and boom, he's back in his body again. And Christ is gone. And again, he awakens. And his wife says, Nathan, what is going on? And he said, I believe it. I believe it. I have to share this. And he started to. They were gathering as their small Indian groups to protest what the government was doing to them. And while visiting a friend's house, Mr. Robinson, having a meeting, discussing discussing religion and all the reasons to be a Christian, a knock came upon the door. And the sheriff came in with a writ to take the Robinsons' land. Nathan, being the person that he was, said, no, this is not right. He said, yes, we're going to arrest him and take him away, because he tore up the writ and threw it on the ground. And the sheriffs took him to leave. Well, Nathan and the neighbors grouped right up, went right out, and they pulled the marshal from his horse. And they beat him soundly. Then, with sharpened sticks, they poked him. And they took off all his clothes and threw him in the woods. And they tied him to a fence post and carried him back to town naked, hanging on a fence post, and threw him in the mud in front of his office and stomped on him and treated him mercilessly while the whole town was coming out to watch, and nobody cared. The sheriff was evil. He was part of an evil government, and they didn't care. So the sheriff kind of got up and went home, naked, still, all beaten, soundly. And again, Nathan and his fellow conspirators, so to speak, returned to their homes, feeling pretty certain that the sheriff wouldn't come back. And if he'd had any brains, he wouldn't have. But the sheriff was getting paid to serve these, and he needed the money. So he got up some more writs and went back to the Robinsons' house to kick them off their land. Lo and behold, Barlow and his friends were waiting again. And this time the sheriff brought a deputy. So now they didn't bother to beat him up and carry him to town. They just simply yanked them from their horses and stripped them of their clothes and beat them soundly. This was in January in Maine. Took all their clothes, beat them up again, beat them with sticks, and told them, don't ever come back or you'll suffer the consequences. Now, the sheriff kind of got the message now, that he wasn't going to be serving anymore. Him and his deputy had to walk 3 miles through the snow, naked, with no boots, to their homes, and they were feeling pretty stupid. But they didn't come back. And the frontiersmen continued to live pretty happily on their properties, and they continued to stand together, and the group kept growing. It grew from about 8 people in the beginning to over 700 people. Nathan was driven that the government was wrong, and this was the promised land. He was driven with that idea, and he was relentless in his defense of it. Well, eventually, Massachusetts got wind of this, the colonial government in Boston. So they sent a militia, a group of armed soldiers, to arrest Nathan. And even the armed soldiers that went up there were afraid. They knew they had to do it quickly. For if the colonists caught them, the frontiersmen, they would have had a battle on their hands, and they knew it. And they were ready. And they went in the night, and they stole Nathan from his home. They claimed it was a good arrest, but it wasn't. They stole him. And they brought him to Boston, where they tried him. They tried him for beating up sheriff that tried to take Robinson's land. They proclaimed that those deeds, which were erroneous and illegitimate, no good at all, were good. The government did. And the colonists, one by one, without their leader, Nathan, who absolutely 100% believed that he had been taken by Christ and he had been destined to do this. Once he was sentenced to 2 years in jail in Charleston, Boston, without their leader, the group eventually lost most of their land. The courts took the land and sent surveyors in and took the land from them. The land was all cleared and now farmable. It was worth much more money. They couldn't afford to buy it when it went to auction. They were hard-scrabble farmers. They had given their lives, and the government still scorned them. This is nothing to be proud of. This is part of our history. This still happens today. It is terrible. But you know, that's what you get when you get government. And this is how 200 or so years ago, people dealt with it. They dealt with it. And this is not a made-up story. This is a story written nearly 100 years ago. It's Nathan Barlow's journey, mysticism and popular protest of the northeastern frontier. This is one of many stories produced regarding the Maine early republic, from revolution to statehood. It's the time in between the revolution and Maine becoming a state. Once Maine became a state, a lot of these owners were given an opportunity to reestablish their rights, and many of them took it. Unfortunately, Nathan went to jail. His father, Obed, who had also homesteaded over 100 acres, just threw up his hands and said, you know, why am I bothering? And he returned to Pocasset, where he lived out the next 7 years of his life. There was still plenty of Barlows there. He came back, he lived with the family. He's buried in the Pocasset Cemetery. I don't know where Nathan is buried. He went back to Maine. He's buried somewhere around Freedom, Maine. But you know, you got to understand that there are people who believe that this earth is in fact the promised land, even today. And these people will make their stand to protect it for everybody. And I hope you all understand that.